HMCS Magnificent was a Majestic-class light aircraft carrier ordered for the Royal Navy, but never actually seeing service with that organisation. Instead, it would see out its roughly decade-long active service career flying the flag of the Royal Canadian Navy. The Canadian Navy already had some carrier experience, having operated the Magnificent's smaller half-sister HMS Warrior as HMCS Warrior for a couple of years from 1946 to 1948, and two small escort carriers before that. But the Warrior, being a Colossus class, lacked a number of key features needed for operating the newer generations of larger aircraft, and so she was returned to Royal Navy service as HMS Warrior once again, before eventually ending up in Argentine service. It had also been designed for the Pacific War, and so Warrior was very good at losing heat, and not all that good at keeping it, which was something of an issue when you were operating in Canadian waters. In place of Warrior, the Royal Canadian Navy would receive Magnificent, which had been laid down in July 1943 and launched in November 1944 from the same Belfast shipyard that had built Warrior and its sister ship Glory. Knowing the problems encountered aboard Warrior, the ship would be fitted with extra heating and insulation during its final fit-out, which would be a very welcome feature for the Canadian crew. Due to the changes needed to make the Majestic class more compatible with newer, heavier and larger aircraft, the ship was slightly longer and significantly heavier than Warrior, and as a result it was a knot slower at 24 knots, and came supplied with the defensive anti-aircraft suite of 40mm guns, although these were a mix of pom-poms and Bofors. With the capacity to take 4 squadrons of fixed-wing aircraft, the ship would initially operate a mixture of Seafires, the sea-based version of the Spitfire, Sea Furies, which were superb examples of the last generation of propeller-driven fighters, and Fireflies, which proved relatively capable as strike and anti-submarine aircraft, as opposed to their originally intended role as carrier-based fighters, a role in which their 2-seat design had been superseded quite some time previously. However, much more capable designs were available in the strike role, and so they were replaced in 1950 by Avengers from the United States Navy for strike, and 5 years down the line, Sikorsky H-04S helicopters were brought in for anti-submarine warfare, the helicopter squadrons gradually reducing the ship's fixed-wing complement. Overcoming the initial issues getting the first iteration of the air wing to work and rapidly acquiring the nickname of Maggie, the ship got to work with its small escort group, which would include the HMCS Hyder. Also overcoming a small not-a-mutiny in 1949, an issue that flared up on a number of Royal Canadian Navy ships that year, but was generally successfully and quietly dealt with. The Korean War, starting the following year, would see a number of Colossus and Majestic-class vessels appearing off the Korean coast, but Magnificent was already committed to a role in the NATO naval structure. Instead, the ship would conduct training, receive a refit, and begin integrating the new Avengers into its air group. Primary amongst these would be Exercise Mainbrace, a gathering of over 200 NATO ships, including 10 aircraft carriers, and the battleships Wisconsin and Vanguard, being the first large-scale NATO fleet exercise involving ships from practically every member nation that had a navy, as well as showing up for the Coronation Fleet Review as Queen Elizabeth II became Queen of Canada, as well as amongst other places some small random island on the other side of the Atlantic. The year after Mainbrace came the even larger exercise Mariner. Magnificent was involved in an incident that almost became the largest peacetime loss of combat aircraft, when, along with the USS Bennington and USS Wasp, she was operating her air group when a thick fog rolled over the fleet and stuck fast. For several hours, the aircraft orbited above the fog, doing everything they could to stretch out their fuel, but the fog wasn't shifting. Eventually, almost 4 aircraft were directed to head for the USS Redfin, a submarine who had surfaced to find a clear patch in the ocean, but one that was too far out for the carriers to reach before the aircraft ran out of fuel. With darkness falling, boats were readied for a possible mass ditching and recovery effort in the freezing Atlantic waters, when suddenly the fog thinned. Not by much, but by enough that it was felt that a very risky landing attempt was preferable to a guaranteed ditching. The orbiting aircraft were therefore ordered to head for a carrier, any carrier, before the fog closed in again, as a number of aircraft were passed where they theoretically should have run out of fuel. pilots heading for Magnificent could barely see a thing, flying towards the carrier's radio beacon in a sea of grey with only the waves visible a few dozen feet below. However, quick-thinking crew dropped flares overboard, and following this little trail of magnesium light, the aircraft were able to make safe, if somewhat sudden, landings as the carrier ridiculously quickly loomed up out of the murk. As well as its own aircraft, Magnificent recovered one of Bennington's Sky Raiders, whose pilot was delighted to learn that, as a ship in the service of the Crown, rum was both carried aboard, and the shaken and tired pilots were welcomed to additional servings in acknowledgement of their close shave. In 1956, the ship was stripped of almost all aircraft to temporarily be converted into a troop transport to move a Canadian force to Egypt as part of the UN's peacekeeping effort in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. This would prove to be her last action with the Royal Canadian Navy, as she would sail for Plymouth in 1957 for decommissioning. Although she was far more capable than Warrior, she had been proven unable to safely operate the new generation of jets, but her replacement and sister ship, the Powerful, now renamed HMCS Bonaventure, could undertake these roles due to having been less complete at the end of World War II, and thus more open to further modification to take on these new aircraft as she was built. The Royal Navy would place Magnificent on the disposal list in 1961, and she was broken up at Faslane in July 1965.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.